After my grandpa's funeral, my greedy parents and brother believed that the entire $90 million inheritance and business would be transferred to my brother. But when my grandma read the will, they were stunned. All the family business and inheritance were transferred to me, and they received nothing. Filled with anger, they threw chairs in frustration. Then suddenly my grandma took a bold step. What happened next was unbelievable. I never thought I'd come back home like this. Not with grief sitting so heavy on my chest, not with unanswered questions gnawing at my mind. But here I was, standing in front of my grandmother's house in New York, feeling like a stranger at the place that once felt like my only safe haven. I took a deep breath and knocked. The door swung open, and there she was, Margaret Carter, my grandmother. But something was different. The warmth that had always been in her eyes when she saw me was gone. Instead, she stared at me like I was a ghost, someone she had long buried. "So, now you decide to show up?" Her voice was cold. I flinched. "Grandma, what's going on?" My voice was unsteady, the weight of the moment crushing me. "I came as soon as I heard about Grandpa." She let out a bitter laugh. "As soon as you heard? You expect me to believe that?" My heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Her expression hardened. "Your grandfather called you over and over, Emily. He was asking for you on his deathbed. He wanted to say goodbye to his little doctor, but you never answered. You never even bothered to visit. How could you be so cruel?" The words hit me like a slap. "No, that's not possible," I whispered, my hands shaking. "I never got any calls. I would never ignore Grandpa." Margaret folded her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Then how do you explain this?" She disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a small notepad. My hands trembled as I took it from her. The number scribbled in Grandpa's familiar handwriting wasn't mine. I stared at the unfamiliar digits, my stomach twisting. "This isn't my number," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've had the same number since high school." "Grandma, they gave him a fake number." Her eyes flickered with something, doubt, pain, maybe even realization. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice softer now. I swallowed hard. "I came home during my university break to see you and Grandpa. Nathan was here. He wouldn't let me in. He said no one was home. Then Mom and Dad told me you and Grandpa were in a nursing home." Margaret's face went pale. "A nursing home? We never." Her voice cracked as she stopped herself. Her hands were shaking. I felt sick. "Mom and Dad told me that you were both moved to a nursing home because Grandpa needed care. I kept asking where, but they always had an excuse. And then they told me about the funeral." Her lips parted in shock. "They told us you didn't want to come." I clenched my fists. "They told me the funeral was at 3 p.m. I showed up at the church at 2:30, but it was already over. When I asked them, they acted like I had mixed up the times. But I didn't." I wrote it down. "I know what I heard." Margaret sank into the porch chair, her entire body trembling. "The funeral was at 11 a.m., Emily." My knees buckled. I gripped the railing for support, my world tilting. "They lied to both of us," I whispered. "They made sure I missed Grandpa's last moments. They made sure I missed his funeral." Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall.
"Not yet."
Margaret finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with sorrow and something else, regret. "They stood in that church and told everyone you didn't care," she whispered. "Your mother, your father, and Nathan. They told everyone you had abandoned your grandfather. Nathan even cried, saying he had tried so hard to reach you." I couldn't breathe. "They made me believe it," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. I was angry. I thought my Emily, my granddaughter, had turned her back on us. But now, she let out a shaky breath. "Now, I don't know what to think anymore." I dropped to my knees beside her chair. "Grandma, I loved Grandpa. I still do. He was the only one who ever believed in me. He never made me feel like I wasn't good enough." Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek, like she was trying to see if I was real. Then just like that, the dam broke. We collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. All the pain, all the years of deception, All the grief poured out right there on that front porch. When we finally pulled away, Margaret wiped her tears with the sleeve of her sweater and squared her shoulders. "Enough," she said, her voice steady now. "We know the truth. That's what matters. But there's something else you need to know." I sniffled, my head still spinning. "What is it?" She stood up, her expression turning sharp again, not with anger at me, but with determination. "We need to talk about your grandfather's will." I frowned. "His will?" She nodded, her jaw tight. "I never read it before, because I was too heartbroken. But now, I think it's time we see what James really wanted." A chill ran down my spine. "Your parents and Nathan think they've won," she continued. "They think they've erased you from our lives. But they're wrong." I wiped my eyes and sat up straighter. "What are we going to do?" Margaret grabbed the phone from the side table. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was firm as she dialed. "Mr. Harrison?" "Yes, it's me. We need to arrange a meeting." "No, it can't wait." I watched as she set the phone down, her eyes blazing with the same fire I used to see in Grandpa's when he fought for what was right. "They'll be here in an hour," she said. "And the lawyer is coming too?" A slow, cold realization settled over me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just the forgotten daughter, the one who was cast aside. I was about to fight back. I sat in the living room, my hands clenched tightly together as I waited. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on my chest. The lies, the betrayal, the years of manipulation. Across from me, Margaret Carter, my grandmother, sat with a calmness that felt unnatural. But I knew better. This wasn't calm. This was the silence before storm. "They think they can just rewrite the truth," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "They think they can erase you, make you the villain. Well, not today." A sharp knock at the door made me sit up straight. "They're here," Grandma said, her voice steely. She gave me a look. "Stay here." I obeyed, staying in the kitchen just as she had asked. I could hear their voices immediately. Nathan, my mother Victoria, my father Jonathan. Their presence filled the house like an unwanted shadow. "Mother, you could have called us earlier if you needed something." My mother's voice rang out, smooth as ever, but I could hear the impatience beneath it. "We have been handling everything since Father's passing," Nathan added, his tone filled with exaggerated concern. "We've made sure everything was taken care of, just as he would have wanted."
"Lies.
"All of it." Grandma didn't waste time.
Sit down."
"Mr. Harrison will be here shortly. We need to discuss James' will." That seemed to catch them off guard. There was a brief silence before my father spoke. "The will?" "Yes," Grandma said. I realized I never actually sat down to read it. "I think it's time we go through it properly." My mother cleared her throat. "There's no need for all that, Mother. We already told you. Nathan and I have taken care of everything. We honored Dad's wishes." Grandma let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I'm sure you did." Another knock. The front door opened. Mr. Harrison, the family lawyer, stepped inside, carrying his briefcase. "Good evening, everyone," he said, nodding politely. Then his eyes landed on Nathan, my mother, and my father. His expression hardened just slightly. "Shall we begin?" he said, pulling out a set of documents. I took a deep breath. This was it. Grandma's voice rang out firm and clear. "Emily, come in." I stepped out of the kitchen and into the living room. Dead silence. Nathan's face froze mid-smirk, his expression turning to shock. My mother's polished demeanor cracked just a little, and my father, well, he didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his posture. "Emily Carter wasn't supposed to be here." "Emily?" My mother blinked, quickly recovering. "I wasn't expecting you." I folded my arms. "Clearly." Nathan let out a scoff. "Well, this is awkward." He turned to Mr. Harrison. "Can we just get on with it?" The lawyer cleared his throat.
"Certainly."
"I have here the official last will and testament of Dr. James Carter." Silence settled in the room as he unfolded the papers. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. "As per Dr. Carter's final wishes," Mr. Harrison began, "all financial assets, properties, and business holdings, including the Carter Medical Clinic, are to be transferred to his granddaughter, Dr. Emily Carter. The air in the room shifted instantly. Nathan sat up so fast that his chair scraped against the floor. "Excuse me?" Mr. Harrison didn't even blink. I heard what you said." Nathan snarled, turning red. His eyes snapped to my grandmother. "Mother, tell me this isn't real." Grandma didn't flinch. "It's real." I watched as my mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening on the armrest. My father remained silent, his face blank. But that's impossible," Nathan sputtered.
What about me?
"What did Dad leave me?" Mr. Harrison flipped a page. "Dr. James Carter left you nothing." The words cut through the room like a knife. "Nothing." Nathan's jaw dropped. "That's ridiculous." He turned to my parents, his voice rising. "Mom? Dad? Say something." My mother finally spoke. Her voice was dangerously soft. "This must be a mistake." "It's not," Mr. Harrison said. Dr. Carter made it very clear. His granddaughter, Emily, worked hard, followed in his footsteps, and cared for people. Nathan, on the other hand, he glanced at my brother. "Well," Dr. Carter saw, through certain behaviors. Nathan shot up from his chair, knocking it over. His face twisted in pure rage. "This is unfair," he shouted. "Dad always said I'd take over everything. He always told me I'd be the one to handle the family business." Grandma's voice cut through his tantrum like ice. "Your father believed in earning, Nathan. You never worked a day in your life." Nathan's hands curled into fists. His face darkened with fury. "This is your fault, isn't it?" He turned his glare on me. "You did this." I stayed calm. "Grandpa made his own decisions." "Like hell he did." Nathan spat. "You were always the perfect one, the little doctor, the golden child." "And what about me?"
Huh.
"Where was my chance?" I stared him down. "You had plenty of chances. You just wasted them." Nathan's eyes flickered with something: hatred, resentment, maybe even desperation. He turned back to Mr. Harrison. "This isn't final. We can contest this." Mr. Harrison didn't even blink.
You can certainly try.
But Dr. Carter made sure his wishes were legally airtight. "Nothing is going to change." Silence. Then, Nathan snapped. Before anyone could react, he grabbed a glass paperweight from the table and hurled it against the wall. It shattered on impact, shards flying everywhere. My mother gasped, standing up. "Nathan, enough." But he wasn't done. He stormed toward me, his face contorted with rage. I stood my ground. Grandma's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "Nathan Carter, you need to leave."
Now?
Nathan froze. He looked at her, his own mother, and then at my father. But my father, for once in his life, didn't defend him. He just stared at the floor. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. "Unbelievable." His gaze locked onto mine one last time. "You'll regret this," he whispered. Then he turned and stormed toward the door, slamming it shut behind him. A heavy silence settled over the room. Mr. Harrison sighed. "Well, that was dramatic." Grandma shook her head. "That boy." She turned to my mother and father. "You raised him like this. You let him believe he was entitled to everything. And now look at what you've created." My mother lifted her chin. "We were just trying to do what was best for our son." "You mean your favorite child?" I said quietly. Neither of them answered. Mr. Harrison packed up his papers. "If there's nothing else, I'll be taking my leave." He nodded at me. "Congratulations, Dr. Carter." As he left, Grandma turned to me. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I took a deep breath. I will be. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Nathan wasn't finished yet. The house was eerily silent after Nathan left. The tension still clung to the air like a thick fog, and I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory, at least not yet. Grandma sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Well," she sighed, "that went about as terribly as expected." I let out a shaky breath. "He's not going to let this go." My mother, Victoria, who had remained silent since Nathan's outburst, finally spoke. You could have handled this better, Emily, she said, her voice sharp. I turned to her, anger simmering beneath my skin.
Me?
You're blaming me? Jonathan, my father, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but as usual, he let my mother do all the talking. You knew how much this meant to Nathan, she continued, standing up and smoothing out her dress. Your grandfather should have split things equally. He should have considered Nathan's future too. I scoffed. He did consider Nathan's future. And he saw exactly what kind of person Nathan had become. That's why he left him nothing. Victoria's face hardened. You were always the selfish one. You never thought about how your success made Nathan feel. Something inside me snapped. Made him feel. My voice rose. Are you serious? I spent my entire childhood being pushed aside, ignored, treated like I was an afterthought while you and Dad poured everything into Nathan. And now you're blaming me because Grandpa saw through all of it. Jonathan sighed heavily, finally speaking. Look, Emily, your mother, and I just wanted what was best for both of you. I laughed bitterly. No, you wanted what was best for Nathan. I was never part of the equation, was I? Neither of them answered. Grandma finally stood up, looking at them both with cold disappointment. You raised a boy who believes the world owes him something. And now he's out there, furious and dangerous because, for the first time in his life, he didn't get what he wanted. That's on you. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but Grandma raised a hand. Enough.
Get out.
My mother blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out of my house, Grandma said, her voice calm but final. Your son just tried to attack Emily, and you're standing here justifying it. I don't want to see either of you again. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, her face turning red. You'll regret this, she said through clenched teeth. No, Grandma said. You will. Jonathan hesitated for a second, looking between us. I thought, just for a moment, that maybe, finally, he would say something, do something to acknowledge the years of neglect. But he didn't. He just sighed, took my mother's arm, and led her out. The door shut behind them, leaving only me and Grandma. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding.
Well, that was
necessary, Grandma finished. We sat in silence for a moment before she reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Emily. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Grandpa would have been proud, too. Her eyes softened. He was always proud of you. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nathan's face, furious, unhinged. I knew him well enough to know this wasn't over. He was going to come back. And I needed to be ready. The next morning, I was at the clinic, trying to focus on work, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I had a bad feeling before I even answered. Hello. Slow, familiar voice greeted me. Hello, little sister. My stomach turned to ice. Nathan? You think you've won, don't you? He said, his tone dripping with resentment. You think you can just take everything and walk away? I tightened my grip on the phone. I'm not taking anything. Grandpa left it to me, because he knew I would actually do something with it. Nathan let out a sharp laugh. Oh, I see. So now you're the noble one? The perfect little doctor, saving the world while your poor brother is left with nothing? You made your choices, Nathan. Grandpa saw through you. His voice dropped into something darker. Well, let's see if you're still feeling so high and mighty when I'm done. The line went dead. I sat there, gripping my phone, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. He wasn't finished, and I had no idea what he was planning next. I sat frozen for a moment, my phone still clutched in my hand. Nathan's voice echoed in my head. Let's see if you're still feeling so high and mighty when I'm done. I knew my brother. This wasn't an empty threat. He was desperate, furious, and most of all, he was dangerous. I immediately called Grandma. Nathan just called me, I said as soon as she answered. He's planning something. There was a pause. Then, her voice came firm and unwavering. Come home.
now.
I didn't argue. Within 15 minutes, I was pulling into Grandma's driveway. As I got out, I scanned the street, expecting Nathan to be lurking somewhere, but there was no sign of him. Inside, Grandma was already making calls. "I'm getting the security system updated."
I don't trust him, she said.
I nodded, my pulse still racing. "I don't either." She hesitated. "Do you think he would?" I knew what she was asking. Would Nathan actually try to hurt me? A few days ago, I would have said no. But after seeing his face when he was disowned, after hearing his voice on the phone, I wasn't sure anymore. Before I could answer, the sound of shattering glass erupted from the back of the house. Grandma and I both froze. Then she whispered, "He's here." My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, Nathan's voice rang out from the back hallway. "Emily." Grandma and I slowly turned toward the sound. Nathan stood there, his face flushed, his eyes wild. He had broken in through the back window. Glass still clung to his clothes. He looked unhinged. "Give me my money," he seethed. My fingers hovered over my phone. "Get out, Nathan." He let out a sharp, bitter laugh.
No.
"You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to take everything from me." Grandma stood up, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she must have felt. "Your father left you nothing, Nathan. That was his decision." Nathan's hands clenched into fists. "It should have been mine. It was supposed to be mine." His breathing was heavy, erratic. He took a step forward. "But you always took everything, didn't you?" His eyes locked on me. The attention, Grandpa's respect, my inheritance. I cut him off. "You never worked for any of it. Grandpa left it to me because I earned it." His face twisted with rage. "Earned? You think, because you went off to medical school, you're better than me?" He took another step forward. "You think because you play doctor, that means you deserve everything while I get nothing?" "Get out of this house," Grandma ordered, her voice shaking with anger. But Nathan wasn't listening. His hands were shaking. His whole body looked like it was vibrating with fury. He lunged. I barely had time to react. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "Give it to me," he shouted. "Give me my share." I struggled, wrenching myself free. "Let go of me." "Nathan, stop." Grandma's voice rang out, but he wasn't stopping. His hands went for my purse, where my car keys, my phone, and my wallet were. He was trying to take something from me, anything, but I fought back. "Get out!" I screamed, shoving him back with all my strength. Nathan stumbled, but didn't fall. His eyes were blazing. And then, the siren sounded. He froze. I didn't even have to look. I knew Grandma had called the police. Nathan's face paled. His chest heaved as he looked between me and Grandma. Then, like the coward he was, he ran. The back door slammed. I ran to the window just in time to see him sprinting down the alleyway behind the house. But it was too late for him. The police were already pulling up, blocking off the street. They caught him within minutes. Nathan was arrested for breaking and entering, attempted assault, and property damage. My parents, who had spent years enabling him, didn't even show up at the station to bail him out. Grandma and I pressed charges. It was the final nail in the coffin. I knew that some part of me would always remember the brother I grew up with. But the man he had become, he was a stranger to me now. I didn't lose a brother that night. I lost him years ago. It's been 4 years since that night. Nathan was sentenced to 3 years in prison. When he got out, he tried contacting me, but I never responded. As for my parents, I haven't spoken to them since. They made their choice a long time ago. Grandma and I still live in the house. I run the Carter Medical Clinic just as Grandpa always wanted. His legacy is alive in every patient I help, in every life I save. One day, while going through Grandpa's old things, I found a photo of us. I was just a kid in the picture, sitting on his lap as he showed me a medical journal. On the back, in his handwriting, were just 7 words. "My little doctor will heal the world someday." I smiled, holding the photo close, because I finally knew the truth. Family isn't about blood. Family is about who stands beside you when the rest of the world turns its back. And I had everything I needed. The end.